Hi, this is Maria Williams. Today I'm making a card that is tall and skinny. I'm using a die set that is primarily for love and Valentine's Day cards, and I'm combining it with balloon stamps and dies to make a happy birthday card. Most of the products I'm going to be using today are from Concord and Ninth. I'm using this Happy Balloons stamp set and coordinating dies. And then I'm also going to use the Little Love Tags dies. These were brought out either in January or February and were meant mainly for Valentine's and love cards. And then I'm also going to be using this cutout from the Birthday Stacks dies. I'm not going to use the stamp set, which is actually a great versatile stamp set, just that die to make some clouds. And then these are the Distress Inks that I'm going to be using. They are Mermaid Lagoon, Abandoned Coral, and Mustard Seed. I'm going to use 110-pound Neenah Solar White for my card base, but since I'm going to do some ink blending on the balloons, I'm going to use Bristol Smooth White cardstock. It's the best for blending your Distress inks and Distress Oxide inks. I very recently got these brushes. They are pretty much the same, I think, as the Picket Fence brushes. Those run about $50 for the 10, and they look exactly the same as this set that I got from Amazon. I had seen a couple of reviews from people on YouTube and decided to give these a try, and I've decided that I do like them. You do have to play around with them a little bit to learn exactly how much ink goes down after you dip them into your ink pad, but they really are easy to use. And the main thing to remember is to try or to test the brush out onto a piece of scrap cardstock before you go to your project. So I've taped my card base down to my glass mat, and then I'm using that die cut that I showed you earlier with the Mermaid Lagoon ink. And at first when I got these brushes, I thought that because the bristles were so soft that I would only get a teeny tiny amount of ink on the cardstock, but as you saw when I practiced, you can get blobs of ink. So don't be fooled and think that you can just tap your brush onto your ink pad and then go directly to your project and get a nice smooth result, because you won't. You do need to get some of the ink off of your brush before you go onto your project. I was getting a little bit too much ink on these clouds, and I thought that I would just keep on going and that once I covered them up with the balloons and everything it would be okay. But as you'll see later, I did end up redoing this part of my card. Depending on the kind of look you're going for, this might be okay, but for what I was doing, the clouds were just a little bit too pronounced. Next, I moved on to stamping my balloons. So I have some Bristol Smooth White cardstock and I'm prepping it with my anti-static bag. And then I'm going to take some Versamark ink and ink up my stamps really well and stamp them onto the cardstock. Versamark ink stays wet for a while, really sticky more than wet, and so I don't have to worry about putting my embossing powder onto each one of the balloons as soon as I stamp it. Once I've stamped all three, I'm going to go ahead and use my Ranger Gold Embossing Powder. This is not the superfine, it's just a regular embossing powder, and coat my images really heavily and then set them with my heat embossing gun. I don't know how it is for you, but embossing never gets old for me. I just love to see that powder melting and getting all nice and shiny. I trimmed a piece of cardstock down so that I could run my balloons through my die cutting machine, and I'm going to use my Big Shot today. And I did use some washi tape. Even though I was using the magnetic platform, I wanted to make sure that nothing shifted out of place. So I did use a little bit of washi tape to cut out my balloons. One thing to note about the Happy Balloons die set is that the two larger balloons cut the balloon and also an outline of the balloon, and this is so that you can make shaker cards if you like. I'm going to hold on to all these pieces because later on, once I've die cut everything and I'm getting ready to ink up my balloons, I'm going to put the balloons back into the cardstock that I cut them out from for easy inking. And here's that step. I'm just carefully lining up all the pieces that I die cut within their negative space, and then just using a couple pieces of washi tape to hold everything tight. Then I can just flip my cardstock over and my balloons are nicely held in place, which keeps my fingers clean, but also keeps me from getting a harsh edge around the die cuts. I don't know if you've ever done any inking, either with an inking tool or one of these brushes. If you just have the die cut sitting there and you're coming onto it from the edge of the die cut tends to come out a good bit darker than the rest of the die cut. Since these are balloons, I really wanted my edges to be nice and soft. So as you can see, I've just tapped my brush into the Mermaid Lagoon ink, and then I am tapping my brush onto a piece of the cardstock right next to the balloon, not on the balloon, and then I'm gently rubbing my brush across the surface of the die cut. I'm trying to do most of the inking around the balloon. I want to keep part of the center of the balloon a little bit lighter color so that it looks almost like the reflection of the light. The Mermaid Lagoon is a really intense color, so I had to tap off a little bit more ink than I had to with the Abandoned Coral. The Abandoned Coral is a softer color, so there was less tapping off than with the Mermaid Lagoon. So if you get these brushes, just be mindful that every ink color that you use is going to work a little bit differently, and of course it depends on what size brush you use as well. When I practiced this, I started out with the really small brushes, but then realized that they didn't work as well as the larger brushes. I colored my third balloon with mustard seed, and one other thing to be careful with if you color in your balloons like I'm doing here is to make sure that your brush doesn't go over the adjacent color. So here I'm making sure that my brush doesn't touch the Mermaid Lagoon that is sitting right next to it, because then I'll probably get some shade of green, and I really don't want that. And these Distress ink oxides do take a little while to dry. I'm going to set the balloons aside, let them get good and dry, and work on my other die cut. I've already run my die through my die cutting machine with some crumb cake cardstock from Stampin' Up, and I did have to use a craft knife to separate some of the little bits, and I need to make sure that I hold on to the center of the O. You could go without, but I like to put the insides of my letters in. And then I'm going to look for the little piece of the A, and my favorite way to keep track of these little pieces is to use a small piece of removable tape and just pick them up with the tape, and you'll see that when I go to glue them back down, it makes it a whole lot easier. I want to add some color behind my letters and behind the hearts, so I'm just taking some of the same Bristol Smooth White cardstock and my inks and simply inking up pretty heavily a little bit of the cardstock, just enough to go behind my letters and my hearts. Then I'll just cut the pieces of cardstock out and use a little bit of liquid glue on the back of the tag to put these pieces in place. You could of course use some coordinating cardstock, but I think this is just as easy, and I wanted kind of the ink blended look to go behind my letters. You could use coordinating cardstock here, but I thought that this would be just as easy as finding cardstock, plus you get a little bit of a different look with the inked cardstock. I wanted to make sure that I didn't have any gaps in between the inked cardstock and the tag itself, so I did put a pretty good amount of glue onto the back of the tag, making sure to put some in between the letters wherever I had enough space. Now I'm going to put the little inside pieces from the A and the O in place, and I'm just going to take my piece of removable tape that I had picked them up with, put a little bit of glue on the back of the piece, which as you can see is really small, and then I can just use the tape to put the little piece in place, hold it there for a second while it dries, and then very carefully peel up the tape while leaving the little piece in place. Okay, so all my pieces are ready, so I'm going to start assembling the front of my card. I'm going to use foam tape for all my pieces. I want there to be some dimension, but not too much because I do want it to fit into that envelope. So I'm just placing, I've already kind of laid everything out on the card front, and then I'm going to apply the foam tape to the back of each of the balloons and put them in place, and then I'm going to attach the tag to the bottom of the card. The one thing that I would have done differently is instead of attaching the tag to the card with the foam tape before tying the twine, is that I would have tied the pieces of twine to the tag and then attached the tag to the card front. My original plan was to tie my metallic twine around the bottom of each balloon and then tie the other end to the tag so that it would look like the balloons were actually carrying the tag through the air. But because there's so little space between the balloons and the tag, I felt like there were just too many loose ends when I had the twine tied around the balloons and the tag. So I decided to only tie the twine to the tag and then just attach the other end of the twine behind the balloons with the foam tape that was already there. So in order to do that, I did have to kind of peel the balloons up off of the foam tape and then slide the twine in between the balloon and the foam tape. And then I just trimmed off the excess with my scissors. I did the same thing with the third balloon and then went back to the first balloon, and I was able to untie the twine so I didn't have to redo the whole thing. To untie the knot, I used the help of my paper piercer and just very carefully stuck it inside the knot and kind of pulled away at it. And because this is metallic twine, it wasn't holding too tightly, so I was able to just pull it off, undo the knot completely, and then straighten it out and put it behind the yellow balloon. Next, I trimmed off all the pieces of twine that were sticking out from the tag, and the card could really be done at this point. But I thought that it looked a little bit plain, so I checked to make sure that it still fit nicely into my envelope and that I had enough space. And I went ahead and cut a card base that was 1/4 of an inch larger on both sides out of Calypso Coral cardstock from Stampin' Up! I then cut the front of my card so that it would fit perfectly in the center of my new card base and glued the two together. For the inside of the card, I decided that I would stencil the balloons. So I took the cardstock that I had die cut the balloons out from and used it as a stencil. I used the exact same colors that I used for the front of the card, and I also put them in the same location. So it's sort of a very simple version of what's on the outside of the card. And actually, you could do the same thing on the front of the card. Instead of die cutting the balloons, you could just stencil them like this and then stamp the details with the Versamark ink directly onto the card front and then heat emboss them the same way. So do you remember my warning earlier about being careful that you don't mix the colors with the brushes? Well, the blue ink and the abandoned coral ink were not quite dry yet when I did my mustard seed balloon. So you'll see that instead of getting a very yellowy mustard seed color, it does turn a little bit green in some areas. I think in this case it's okay because since the balloons are so sheer, you would actually be seeing through all 2 or 3 balloons. So I think it works out okay, but it is something to be mindful of. For the sentiment on the inside of the card, I have picked out the Happy and Birthday from the Happy Balloons stamp set, and I've already placed it in my MISTI and made sure that it was straight. Now normally distress inks are not recommended for stamping because they can turn out kind of blotchy, but because this is such a small sentiment and it's kind of a little bit wonky, I think that it's okay, and I did stamp it twice to make sure that I got a solid enough impression. So I think for certain things you can get away with stamping with distress inks. I glued my inside panel into the inside of my card, and then I wanted some strings on the balloons, but I wanted them to be kind of faint because I'm going to want to write a message on the card, and so I don't want the strings of the balloons to interfere. So I had this really old Creative Memories gold pen, and it seemed to be working okay, but then once I got to my second string, it really just stopped working. So I've ordered a new pen. It's from Uniball, and I already received it, and I tried it on dark cardstock, and it is great. So I will be using that one from here on out. When the card was pretty much done, I felt like it still looked a little bit plain and could use a little bit of bling, and so I took some gold stars, I guess they're sequins because they have a hole in the middle, and just kind of placed them around the card and used some Ranger Multi-Matte Medium to glue them down. I'm using a Marvy jewel picker to help me deal with my sequins, and I do like the jewel picker better than those other tools. I have one of those Silhouette, I think it's called a pick-me-up tool. It has that sort of putty that comes out through the center, and those are okay, but personally I like the jewel picker a little bit better. Once I was done with the sequins, I decided to add a little bit of Wink of Stella to my tag since it looked a little bit flat. And then, of course, I didn't stop with the tag. I put Wink of Stella all over the balloons as well. And one thing to note is that the Distress ink may reactivate and the Wink of Stella will move some of the ink around. So be careful when you're going from one balloon to the other. And also even within each one of the balloons, when you are putting on the Wink of Stella, just make sure that you don't get big streaks on your balloon. So here's the finished card. I hope you enjoyed this alternate use of the Little Love Tags die, and that you will look at your dies from Valentine's Day and see how you can put them to use on other types of cards. And before I go, I just wanted to show you another card that I made with the Happy Balloons stamps and dies. And you can see how I use the outline of the balloon on that center balloon that says Happy Birthday. So it's not just for shaker cards. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you enjoyed the video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. I hope you have a great day. For links to the products I used and still shots, please visit my blog at mariascardsandmore.com.